Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. So Project Poirot rolls on with another installment, and actually I'm bringing you a book today I wasn't expecting to get to until next week because originally when I was making my list I included at this point a play that Agatha Christie wrote about Hercule Poirot called Black Coffee, and I had intended to read that because I knew that my library had a copy of that and I hadn't read it before, so I was excited. Come to find out, though, it's actually a novelization of that play, and yeah, I tried to get into it, but it just clearly is not Agatha Christie's actual words, and yeah, I didn't think it was worth commenting on because it's her story, and I think the dialogue is probably from the play, but all the description is not from her, and yeah, I just didn't feel like it was a fair entry into this little project. So we're not doing Black Coffee this week. Instead, we are doing The Peril at End House. So by my reckoning, this is the 7th Hercule Poirot novel, and it's one in which we get Captain Hastings back because if you'll remember The Mystery of the Blue Train, Captain Hastings is absent, so we have a third-person narrator in that one. Well, in this one, he's back, so we get a first-person Captain Hastings narrator, and I'll be interested to see how many more Hastings is in because yeah, he doesn't stick around for a whole lot longer, I don't think. But anyway, for now, we have him back, and, the dynamic duo is at it again. So I would characterize Peril at End House as, like, a really good standard Christie, right? Like, it's very reminiscent to me of a number of books that we'll encounter later on. I don't know that there's a lot about it that is terribly unique. That being said, I also think that there's nothing, it's good because it's Agatha Christie. So I don't think that it's something that is particularly memorable, but I don't know that that's a wholly bad thing when it comes to Agatha Christie. So anyway, quick plot synopsis, and as a reminder, I keep these spoiler free, so even if you've not read this book, you can keep watching. Of course, I encourage you to read, and hopefully this will pique your interest, but you can keep watching even if you have not read this book. So basically, Hastings is back from the Argentine, and if you'll remember, he moved there, and I think it would be the equivalent of about 1923 with his wife to a big ranch that they bought, and this book was published, I believe, in 1932. So he's been down there for a good while. But anyway, he's visiting his good friend Hercule Poirot, and they go on a little vacation together to the English Riviera and this little town, I think it's called St. Lou, L-O-O, like Waterloo. So they're staying in this little seaside resort, and they encounter a young woman named Nick Buckley. Now, her real name is Magdala, but she goes by Nick because her grandfather went by Nick, and she's, meant to be a lot like him, I guess. And I identified with that because my nickname actually is because I was born on my grandfather's birthday, so we share a nickname together. But anyway, so she kind of encounters them, and while she's talking to them, she's talking about how there's been some, unfortunate incidents where she's almost died, and there's kind of a threat on her life, and while she's talking to them, somebody tries to shoot her, so Poirot says, okay, I believe you, let's go see what's going on. So they go up to her house, and she is sort of she's rich, but she's fake rich, which is a very, it's very characteristic of this time in British history. So she has some family money and she has a family estate, but she's actually having to rent out the lodge on her estate to a couple of Australians just to even make the mortgage payments, and she doesn't really have a lot of ready cash. But anyway, so she's got some friends staying with her. There's sort of a house party thing, which is, something that happens in Christie novels quite a bit. And they're all sort of what you might describe as bright young things. So they're very fashionable. There's a lot of drugs happening in this novel, which I alluded to, I think, maybe in one of the past books. I definitely talked a little bit about how there's this rising sense of drugs, recreational drugs being a thing among the upper class, but that is definitely a huge theme in this book. So there's a lot of recreational cocaine use happening in this book, and they're all just sort of hanging out, and I'm trying to remember who all the characters are in this one. I like this book, but it's also not super memorable to me, so if I'm struggling a little bit, I apologize. But if I remember rightly, she's got a lawyer who is actually also her closest relative, / who's also trying to date her. So she's got 3 different people trying to date her in this book, and none of them is a winner. So there's this guy who is her relative. Like, if she dies, he inherits her estate, which is part of why he's a suspect. Okay, so he's trying to date her. There's this guy named, I think, Commander somebody or other. Turns out he's a drug dealer. Yikes. So he's trying to date her, another winner. And then she's also dating this guy named Michael Seaton, who I think is meant to essentially be like Charles Lindbergh kind of a thing. He's like trying to, cross the Atlantic in a plane for the first time. And his uncle is like this crazy woman hater who won't let him marry anybody or else he won't get his wealth. And so like he's got some like, weird like daddy issues. So none of these people are great, but these are the three people who are interested in her who we meet. We also meet her BFF, Freddie, who is married to a drug dealer, and she's like trying to get out of that marriage, but that's not going great. She's also addicted to cocaine. There's another guy who has a crush on Freddie. And then I think at Poirot's prompting, Nick invites her cousin Magdala, no, her name is Magdala. She invites her cousin Maggie to come visit. And so that's sort of the setup. And spoilers, but not really, somebody dies. And then Poirot and Hastings are trying to figure out who done it. So I think that this is a huge improvement over The Mystery of the Blue Train, which, as I mentioned in that review, just had way too many goddamn characters and nobody, like, I couldn't keep track of them. I didn't care what half of them were doing. I think this is a much more focused book and therefore is a much better book. Now, that being said, I figured out the mystery in this one literally like 20 pages in the first time I read it, and as soon as I started reading it I was like, oh wait, I think I remember how I figured this out. Oh yeah, okay. So for me, it therefore doesn't end up being that great, but from what I've read, like, I think part of the reason why I guessed whodunit was because I've read so much Agatha Christie that like she has a couple of little like tricks or quirks that if you've spotted them once you are aware to look for them again, and this is one of those times. So I don't want to say that it's like predictable, because I don't think that's it necessarily, but I think if you're familiar with Christie's work, you definitely can figure out who done it. And I think it's one of the mysteries that she wrote that is fair to the reader in terms of you have all of the clues that you need to figure out who did it. So from like an enjoyment perspective, I found it perfectly enjoyable, much better than the last book I read for this project, but not especially like memorable or great. Now, in terms of sort of like the moral development stuff, I did think that there were some interesting things going on with that, so that's more what I was interested in when I was reading this. So, I mean, I think this book is very indicative of its time period, which is something I say a lot in these videos, but it is because I think in particular this is very indicative of sort of the decline and fall of the British aristocracy, which is a book that I own and would like to read at some point during the course of this project. But basically Nick is kind of representative of this generation of aristocracy who like their kids are not going to be rich, right? Like the estates are kind of on their last legs. We're now in the early 30s, so the world is sort of in the throes of the Depression, and I think that there's sort of underlying malaise and sort of depressive feeling about this book. So whereas in earlier books, I'm thinking particularly of like the Seven Dials mystery and The Secret of the Chimneys, those had young people who were similarly situated to the young people in this book, but there's a lot of sort of like gaiety and frivolity and sort of like joie de vivre in those young people, whereas these young people are all just like depressed drug addicts kind of. And I think that that must be representative of the fact that we're out of the 20s and we're now in the 30s, and just the fact that essentially the British aristocracy is never going to recover. I think in the 20s maybe there was still some hopefulness of like, yeah, we're going to bounce back from World War I and be back to the heights of our power and influence, and like that's just not really happening. So I think that there's just some kind of like existential depression happening basically in this book that's reflective of the broader culture. Like I remember when they're describing the kind of house of this book, she talks about how it's furnished both with like really decrepit Victorian, like falling apart antiques, as well as like cheap ultra modern furniture. So like imagine if you went into like an old rundown house and the things that were in it were like couches that were falling apart from the thrift store and IKEA furniture. Like I think that's kind of the vibe we're supposed to get, of like you have this sort of old money and they're trying to hold on to it, and like make it last, juxtaposed with sort of like this cheap make it work furniture. So I feel like that's sort of like a visual, I think that that's meant to be a metaphor for the entirety of sort of like the situation that these people find themselves in. So added to that kind of overall depressing feeling is the fact that nearly everybody in this book is a drug addict, specifically a cocaine addict, and that definitely adds sort of this layer of, at least to a contemporary reader, like when we think of a cocaine addiction, we're not thinking of that as like, oh, recreational fun drugs. Like we think of that as sort of like a hard, you know, like it's one thing if you kind of are using it occasionally on the weekends for a party, but like if you're a cocaine addict, that's like sort of a like grim place to find oneself. So the recreational drug use in this book is interesting, and I think part of what Christie is commenting on is like the rise of sort of like modern, like new kind of norms among young people. So there's a lot of discussion about drug addiction, and then there's also a lot of discussion about like divorce, because Freddie wants to divorce her drug addict, well, he is a drug addict, but he's also a dealer. She wants to divorce that husband, and prior to this period of history, like that just would not have been really an option. So I think that there will increasingly be discussion of divorce in these books as something common and as something like driving plots, because divorce is now like an open option for people in a way that it just wasn't prior to around this time period. Like not just legally, but also just socially, it's much more acceptable. We also see a lot of like interesting new technologies that are kind of discussed and, you know, serve as plot points. So like I said, we sort of have a Charles Lindbergh stand-in, and there's also direct allusions to Amelia Earhart. So sort of like the intrigue of air travel is on the rise. We have like record players and radios and a lot more cars, things like that. So some of the like hallmarks of 20th century life are becoming more common and are being discussed more overtly. We also have our return of the good old theme of xenophobia and fear of foreigners. So there's a maid in this house who is depicted as overtly distrusting Poirot, essentially because he's a foreigner. And Christie kind of talks about this in the context of her class, as if it is just sort of a part of being in the serving class that you're a little bit suspicious of foreigners, and ha ha ha, isn't that like adorable how these servers are so dumb, I guess. I mean, not that exactly, but that's sort of how it reads to me now. But the interesting thing is that we know that Hastings, who is like the embodiment of all that is English, is also completely subject to xenophobia and sort of prejudices about various people. For instance, in this book in particular, he has a lot of assumptions about like sort of this good old boy Englishman and how he must sort of be like good people because he's so typically English, and, you know, as Hastings is wont to do, he has completely misjudged the situation. So we have our recurring theme of xenophobia is back. And then finally, I think that there's some interesting character things happening in this one, particularly the character of Nick, who is sort of, you know, I mean, she's the one whose life is being threatened, and she is definitely, I think, the most interesting sort of character that Agatha Christie paints for us in this particular book. She's, I think, kind of a study in contrast in a lot of ways, because she seems so fashionable and kind of her moment, but she's also living in this sort of like decrepit, falling apart house that she has to rent part of all of the time. She's described by some of her friends as an incurable liar, so like you kind of don't know exactly where you stand with her. She has a secret engagement, even though which I didn't mention earlier, but yeah, she has a secret engagement going on, but she also has all these suitors that she's sort of playing a little bit. Like, you just never totally know where you stand with her. And I think I mentioned this in the Murder of Roger Ackroyd, but we have another example here of where this discussion of genetics becomes very, you know, interesting, because essentially she goes by the nickname Nick because she is said to be very like her grandfather. So it's interesting to think about that and how he's described, and then put that in light of her character in this book. And then finally, just like kind of on a more literary note, like it's interesting this book to see kind of how Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings partnership is developing, because they are much more partners in this book than they really have been up to this point. Like, Hastings is just a lot less dumb, basically. Like, he actually can figure some things out, and he's more astute than he has been, which I don't know if that's just a product of Christie developing as a writer, or she's trying to show, you know, Hastings has aged like 12 years at this point, so, you know, he's developing as a character as well. I don't know, but like they're much more partners in this. They do bicker a lot, which is a lot of fun. Like I always love listening to her Hercule Poirot trash Hastings. That always cracks me up. But they have a fun dynamic in this, and actually I've already read the next book in this project, and I can say that in the next book it's even more so that they're partners now. So yeah, I thought that was kind of fun to see as I'm reading chronologically, actually picking up on that. So in terms of my overall rating for this, I would give this probably a 3 out of 5 on Goodreads, or that would be a 4 out of 7 unicorns for my rating system. This is a very typical Agatha Christie book, and it's a perfectly respectable place to start with her. It's a perfectly respectable mystery. It's not very memorable to me, and like I said, because I happened to read this pretty late in my Agatha Christie reading career, I could figure out who done it very quickly just because I know her quirks. But I think if you didn't know that, this would be a very satisfying one to read because it's fair. Like you have all the pieces you need to figure it out, and that if you like mysteries where you can try to figure it out and actually be able to do that, this is a good book for that too. So in terms of where I put it in my overall ranking, I would consider this to be probably definitely above The Mystery of the Blue Train, which is definitely the worst one I've read so far. But you know, I'm gonna say I didn't enjoy this one as much as I did The Murder on the Links, so I'm gonna put it beneath that and over The Mystery of the Blue Train. And yeah, I expect that it'll stay somewhere in the middle as we go along, maybe falling further down, who knows. Like I said, I feel like I'm trashing this. I'm not trying to do that. I just think in the scheme of everything she wrote, this isn't one of my favorites, nor is it one of the worst ones. So that will do it for Project Poirot for this week. If you have read this book, definitely let me know what you thought below. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. And I guess that will do it. I will talk to you guys next time. Bye!